Hello! Today we're going to look at health in a broad perspective, and we are going to examine health issues from different evolutionary perspectives. To give you a short overview of what we are trying to look at, we're going to look at models of health and disease from an evolutionary perspective. We will mainly focus on issues that are relevant for public health, infectious diseases, and also touch upon mental health issues. Very central for discussing health issues is life history theory, so we're going to look at some of the important aspects of it. In particular, we're going to look at trade-offs and the idea of forecasts. Then we're going to focus on a very important aspect which is called developmental plasticity and the idea of differential susceptibility. And finally, we will round off with a return to the ideas of the extended evolutionary synthesis and how it can help us to make better sense of health issues, taking into consideration both genetic, cultural, and gene-culture co-evolutionary processes. Let's start off with a few examples. The first one is here a very classic example, sickle cell disease, which is caused by a mutation on one specific nucleotide on chromosome 11, which changes the expression of the beta globin gene, which means that if you have two variations or two alleles that are recessive and encode for this sickle cell, your blood is less likely to carry enough oxygen, and there is a chance that there's going to be some blocking in your veins, and so you're going to suffer, quite severely. Potentially, quite often people actually die if they have the two recessive copies. And you would probably think, in this case, being a carrier of potentially this disease should disadvantage you in everyday life. But here we have to think about what is the environmental context. What we know is that, for example, with the emergence of Bantu groups in Africa moving into new areas, they started to clear the land to grow yams. As they were clearing the land, they created more space for puddles, so for water to accumulate, and which of course then becomes a perfect breeding ground for mosquitoes. And these mosquitoes, specific types of mosquitoes, carry malaria, which then of course has a very strong negative effect on the human body. So it's a very dramatic health condition. And it's exactly in these conditions where humans changed the natural environment and created a space for a parasite to spread more easily, that sickle cell disease all of a sudden becomes potentially evolutionary adaptive. Because what happens is that individuals who have at least one of these recessive alleles, so a reduced capacity to carry oxygen through the body, have a higher chance to be less severely affected by malaria. So all of a sudden this genetic liability becomes an advantage in the context of another disease that is present in your environment. And so therefore what we see is we have in modern populations a strong correlation between the sickle cell allele, so individuals who are carrier of this potentially fetal, fetal disease, and the spread of malaria. So all of a sudden the disease carriers become better adapted to the local environment. So what would be characterized as a predisposition for a specific disease, and therefore would be seen as medically anormal, or like needs to be looked at, all of a sudden becomes advantageous. Another example, a study conducted in Ethiopia. So now let's have a look at public health campaigns. We know that women work a lot in very harsh environments, often carrying water, for example, for over long distances. And this is a very strong health burden for women, right? Because it taxes their body, decreases life expectancies, because you have reduced access to clean water, increases the chances of water contamination. So it is a health burden, needing to carry water over long distances and not having access to water. So one of the interventions, public health interventions, was to create access to water in local villages. So putting water lines in, having a tap in the village, so women would not need to walk these distances in order to get clean water. So water would be relatively easily available for everyone, and it should increase health, right? So this was the assumption. But what the researchers found was, if you look at the overall pattern, so here it's a comparison between areas where a water tap was offered or was made available, and areas, villages where water was still restricted, so women had to walk long distances and to carry the water on their heads back to the village. And what we can see here is, as soon as the water became available, women were more likely to become pregnant more rapidly again. What does that mean? It doesn't mean necessarily that more children were dying. So we can see here, so first of all, the time between the last birth and the next birth significantly reduced in those villages where there was now more easy access for water. And having access to water meant that kids were less likely to die in those villages. Right? So that's obviously an advantage. But what you also see is, again here, the birth weight of these children now, having more kids with a higher frequency, reduced the birth weight. So what happened was, it increased the birth rate and it increased malnutrition. So even though more children survived, the overall health status of these kids was lower. And obviously also for the women, because now they were pregnant more often, the health risks for women also increased. So the argument here is, sometimes public health interventions that have good intentions can backfire, in that they actually decrease health, even though the intention was to increase health. So how can we make sense of this from an evolutionary perspective? We have on one hand an example where a genetic predisposition for a disease all of a sudden becomes advantageous, and we also have a situation where a public health intervention that increases access to clean drinking water actually decreases health by increasing birth rate and increasing childhood malnutrition. What we have to think about, what is actually a disease from a medical perspective? The classic assumptions are, or the classic theories are related to germ theory. So we have pathogenic microorganisms that affect the body and throw the body out of a balance. Or we have all sorts of theories related to cellular pathology, where cells in our body try to maintain a homeostasis, and if there are any kind of stressors on the cells that like destabilize that homeostasis, our body becomes sick. Both of these theories assume that there is a quote-unquote normal biological process that would happen in the absence of a disease, and so disease therefore becomes a deviation from normal biological functions. And these symptoms that we can measure are seen as indicators of an underlying physical abnormality, and because these indicators are objective and we can measure them, we can get some information about the disease status of a body. And if we increase our measurement of these or we improve our measurements of these indicators, get more indicators, we get a better understanding of what is actually going on in the body and how we can make the body quote unquote healthy again. So this is the classic disease model in biology. But here we have to come back to a classic distinction that we already talked about right at the beginning of the course. For example, David Sloan Wilson's book, which took this approach, which is Tinburgers' 4 questions, to try and help us understand how evolution actually affects all sorts of behavior. So the 4 Tinburger questions, just a quick recap. Proximal mechanisms can be looked at from a static perspective, so looking at the mechanisms, how a specific trait works, so the structure, the physiology, what triggers certain behaviors, and also ontogeny, how does a trait develop within an individual over their personal lifetime. Whereas distal processes are concerned with long-term trajectories, on one hand understanding why did a specific trait evolve over many generations, and what does the trait actually do in terms of enhancing reproductive success. And so if you think about what classic biology or medical science tries to do, it typically focuses on the mechanism. So what triggers a specific body reaction, and how can we change that body reaction? Potentially there's even some attention to ontogeny, so developmental trajectories for specific individuals, but the issue of ultimate functions and evolutionary trajectories that can be captured in phylogenies are typically not of interest for medical researchers. And this is really what evolution can offer to the understanding of disease, because we need to focus on both the developmental processes and the mechanistic processes together with the long-term phylogenetic and functional causes of any kind of body function. If we come back to another slide that you have seen already, as humans moved into different areas around the globe, our body actually adapted to the local conditions. And we already briefly touched upon the often counterintuitive effects where genetic adaptations would help individuals adapt to local conditions, which then often had long-term negative consequences because the adaptation to, for example, disease or a specific type of food that would be available in one specific location would often have negative consequences for other body functions. A classic example of pleiotropic effects, where one gene would encode for various other functions at the same time. And this is a really important idea and concept that we need to consider when thinking about disease. Because bodies are, evolutionary speaking, compromises. Our bodies are designed to adapt to local environments and help us survive long enough to procreate and have offspring. And so all of these features that our bodies have are developed over a long history, a long evolutionary history, which did not have in mind, which was not purposeful, which did not have in mind the ultimate end state of us humans, but created small changes and adaptations over time, which would accumulate, and then subsequent mutations would refine the specific trait in order to fit into a local environment, right? So these are compromises. Our bodies are compromises. They are not perfectly designed to fulfill a specific function. So there is no such thing as a normal body, and there is no such thing as a normal human genome, because our bodies are complex compromises where specific genes try to help our bodies, these gene vessels, to survive long enough in a specific environment. So disease from an evolutionary perspective is inevitable. We can't avoid disease, and the state of our body is always prone to be malfunctioning. The important point here is that diseases are not themselves products of natural selection, but the vulnerabilities that could lead to diseases, to suffering, to problems that do not allow us to function properly, are shaped by natural selection. Right? So there are always vulnerabilities that we inherit through a long history of evolution. In the course we already talked about, for example, some of these genes that we inherit from even tarsiers or even further back, where there are specific adaptations for specific environments that we now inherit that are not relevant anymore. So we have vulnerabilities that can lead to diseases. And we have to think about that genetic self-interest, so passing on our genes, reproduction, could actually and often will undermine our health and longevity. So there's always this kind of trade-off that we have to consider when talking about disease. We also have to think about that defense mechanisms such as pain, the sensation that you have when experiencing something unpleasant that we often describe as pain, or fever, or coughing, or other reactions are actually useful. They are functional. So pain helps us to avoid specific situations or specific stimuli, or make us aware of specific body states in order to get away from them, and helps us to survive. If we would not have a feeling or a sensation of pain, and there are individuals that have genetically a reduced pain sensitivity, these individuals often do not survive for very long because they are not aware when their body is in danger, and therefore are more likely to die. So it's a really important thing to consider, that pain actually, we often try to get rid of pain, but pain, evolutionary speaking, is really informative because it provides us information about our body and how it is interacting with specific internal or external environments. And so blocking these defenses, for example, taking painkillers, reducing fever, or reducing coughs, can have costs. There can be benefits, but we also have to remind ourselves that fever, pain, coughs, and other defense mechanisms are functional adaptations of our body. And so we have to consider them and find out what they may tell us. So this is an important feature also if we think about the idea that there are these objective indicators like high temperature or perceptions of pain. They often are defense mechanisms in reaction to something else. Right? So these are some important first insights about diseases from an evolutionary perspective.